As we think about what our country's founders were doing 250 years ago, farming, it's interesting to see how other anniversaries of our country were noted in the almanac. 200 years ago, there was nary a mention of an anniversary, but there was a guide to raising asparagus. 150 years ago, the editor wrote, "'Tis 100 years since our fathers founded the nation. Long live the Republic. And that she may live long, let her sons cherish public and private virtue, put good men in office and keep them there during good behavior." 100 years ago, the topic of importance was the worth of manure, and a strong suggestion to visit other farmers to learn from them. 50 years ago, there was no real mention of the country's anniversary, but information on how to preserve and profit from forests, and a lament on how there were too many things to read, magazines, newsprint, and books, ending with this quote, "But of course, we don't have to read everything." Good advice that's still true today. Well, welcome to our episode of the Old Farmer's Almanac podcast. We're calling it Gardening Like It's 1776, What America's First Gardeners Still Have to Teach Us. So my guests today are Susan Peery. She's a writer for the Old Farmer's Almanac, but a former managing editor of the Almanac, and one of her favorite areas of research and writing is heirloom gardening and thinking about early American gardeners and gardening. And John Forti, his handle is the Heirloom Gardener. He's an ethnobotanist. He's the gardener at Bedrock Gardens, the horticulturalist, I should say, at Bedrock Gardens in Lee, New Hampshire. But you've also done stints at very important historic gardens, including Plymouth Plantation and Strawberry Bank. You were a past director of the Mass Horticultural Society, too. So lots of cred there in terms of speaking about old gardens. But I'd like to invite both of you to say a little bit more about this interest area for you, if you want to start, Susan.
I'm more like a lifelong gardener, a hobby gardener. My grandma was a gardener. My dad was a gardener. I actually have some of the plants that I brought from Wisconsin to New England, kind of reverse migration. And I just love gardening.
But you have also really done quite a few stories when I look in our archives about thinking about early gardening techniques and things that maybe we keep around from those days.
Right. I think I really just love our connection with the past, because in most ways we're doing the exact same thing that people did in 1776 or even 1576. You know, it's still the same process. You're still dependent on the weather. You're still dependent on your location and your orientation to the sun. And there's so much wisdom in the old ways of gardening.
Yeah, that's true. How about you, John? What got you hooked on this looking to the past in terms of gardening?
I think most everybody's a product of place, and I was raised by a river where there had been an old shipyard 100 years before me, and a 17th century shipwright's house and tavern and well, and the stone walls that ran through pine forests that really helped me know people lived there before me. And I had neighbors in the arts and crafts house just up the hill from us that were amazing gardeners that kind of led me down this path in many ways too, as well as grandparents who were amazing farmers. And so I've been a lifelong organic gardener. And in addition to the places I've worked, I've always tried to work with organizations that carry that historical knowledge into the present. So I work as a biodiversity specialist and governor for Slow Food USA, and I've been on the board of the Herb Society of America, and organizations that I think really help take those past practices and help people see not just how they're viable for the present, but how they're so important for moving into a better future.
Yeah, I feel like in my position, I'm constantly reading and learning about ways that we should reinstitute or think about or really had been around that we left behind. And now we realize, you know, and we'll talk about some of these, that there was so much wisdom in them and that we, you know, abandoned in ways, especially on the, you know, when we think about large scale farming, you know, so we have maybe something to learn from the past in all facets. So, of course, a big topic of this year is 1776, our 250th anniversary. And Susan wrote a wonderful story, Gardening Like It's 1776, for the 2026 edition, though the 2027 is almost out. And so I was thinking about that. We were declaring independence, but we were really, as you say, just doing the same things. We're trying to grow our own food at that time, and the weather is our nemesis or our friend. So can we talk about what was happening politically at that time, as well as what was happening in people's gardens?
I think one thing that was happening was great interchange of native plants from North America that were new to Europe, and throughout the whole 1700s, but especially around the time of the Revolution, there was great back and forth between botanists here, in the Bartrams in Philadelphia, and people who were running some of the great gardens of England, and such wonderful interest in what plants would work well where, and people would ship plants, on sailing ships that took 6 weeks to get there probably, and try new things in their gardens. And we've always been bringing things from Europe.
Right. So it wasn't just tea that we were trading. We were sharing
really.
plants.
We have the inventory lists like from Jefferson and George Washington of what they were buying from maybe John Bartram or other suppliers here. And I think it's just great. And people just depended on what they grew, so they really wanted to have the best, and ornamentals too.
Right. It was an exciting time for plant sharing.
I think so. And, while so much of that was going on, I still think a lot of what happens historically and in the present is people just going about trying to live their daily lives while they're trying to stay afloat while the world is shape-shifting. And whether it's 1776 or today, I think people were looking at ways to make a difference one backyard at a time, and keeping your family well fed and nourished, working with your community to support the others that were growing the things that you didn't grow was a part of it. And I think one of the movements from the politics of that day was the movement to have Liberty teas. Plants like bee balm and lemon balm, New Jersey tea and wintergreen and goldenrod were really a big part of how they strategized as gardeners to drink American plants, natives, instead of buying black tea from the British. And that was an important piece for home gardeners and household botanists. But again, I think most people were just these women who don't often get recorded in history that were holding down the fort, basically.
Well, and so Susan's story is really about the kitchen garden. And so let's talk a little bit about that. Why did every household have one?
Right. Well, right outside the kitchen door were all the things you kind of needed, partly for cooking. Maybe the big crops would be outside, where they could sprawl like cabbages and pumpkins and things. But it was the pharmacy. It was a source of fragrance, and it was a source of food. And it was, I think, the women that were in charge of those kitchen gardens. Mm-hmm. And you had to be your own druggist back then. So
So every household had to have one, really. You can't step away from that. Everybody had to be a grower. I think when we think about the beginnings of the almanac in 1792, 90% of the people that were living in North America were farmers. And now it's about 2%.
Right.
So.
There's a wonderful quote that we found at the time of the 200th anniversary of the almanac in 1992, and it talked about a traveler from from England, going from Boston out to Marlborough, Mass. So that's like 30 miles straight west, and saying it was like one continual garden.
That's cool.
I know. It's really beautiful to kind of imagine how that looked.
Yeah. Were you going to say something?
And I love that quote because it's the reminder that what we do, garden to garden, household to household, becomes a green corridor and a watershed. And those kitchen gardens, even if you didn't farm, even if you had another trade, you still would have had a kitchen garden. And the idea was you build it right outside your back door so that it helped you raise your children to be household botanists and to be growers and to know the plants. You know, we knew about 1,500 plants at the time that were commonly in use for forage, for food, for medicine. And that was all part of this outdoor classroom that every child was raised with right in their backyard. And I love borrowing the model of kitchen gardens because even though some people would have larger sized market gardens, the kitchen garden was a fenced space. Archaeological evidence shows that they were made often with wood, in the abundance of wood and stone in this region, both of those, so that you could elevate them, really create intense organic soil that you could grow well in, have pathways to work in, raised beds to make the labor easier as well. And a whole lot of thought went into how those beds were laid out, both for productivity and aesthetics. But as you said, Susan, they were the pharmacy, they were the grocery store, and every household needed them.
So 1,500 plants that you know of, what were the most essential things people had to grow?
Well, I think herbs that were used for both flavoring and as cures. And John, you would know this better, but how long did it take, do you think, the colonists to figure out that the native wisdom about medicinal uses of the native plants here was something that they could kind of learn and use themselves? Because there were a lot of plants like I think bee balm and maybe sassafras and other things that were used medicinally that were new to the Europeans.
Sure. Well, you know, when we're talking about the common threads with history, I'm also not a person that romanticizes history. And I think there was a lot that came down to obstinate practices that, you know, you bring the plants you're most familiar with and your own style of medicine. But when they came to the New World, plants like sassafras were already being exported back into Europe, as goldenrod and aster were, you know, some of the most beloved garden plant introductions into Europe, and bee balm by 1640. So really, I think it wasn't always that they adopted the ways as much as plants, because they had different systems of understanding medicine. But I also think for those essential crops that you're asking about, it was an overlay of native as well as introduced plants. Staples like beans, corn, and squash. The colonists brought what they called corn, which was peas corn and wheat and rye corn and barley corn for the things that they typically ate instead. But they also immediately took up growing the beans, corn, and squash because place-based agriculture said that's what would do best here. But they also brought a lot of the staple crops that they'd known in their kitchen gardens that could be eaten fresh, because a big part of that 1,500 plants is they were all seasonal plants, and you had to know how to move through 4 seasons of the year and keep your family fed. So they brought things like lettuce and spinach and collards and kale, a lot of perennial greens and storage crops, all kinds of small fruits and orchard fruits that really became a part of a new American plant palette that layered what all of these generations of immigrants brought on top of native plants.
So were the people who were indigenous to North America sharing knowledge with the people in 1776? It feels like medicinal plants, they knew a lot about them. And so was there enough of an exchange at that time for them to be learning from each other?
Certainly, in that, you know, there are records from colonial New England that speak of learning how to plant the Three Sisters together and seed saving from those crops and storage methods for those crops. But I do see, other than the use of medicinal plants adopted by Europeans, not a lot of exchange, but you know full well there were things that came along like Joe Pye weed that were used for typhoid or breakbone fever that when they saw them utilized, they adopted. but they thought of their medicinal system as the science of their day, and they did not look upon native practices as cultured as theirs. And so there were a lot of colonial biases that got carried into settlement as well.
That's interesting. So we talk about the woman probably running this kitchen garden of the household and children gaining skills, but what were those necessary skills? Did they bring them with them? Did they have to learn them when they, settled here, or a combination? What were the...
Well, some of the things had to be brought over and practiced every single year. If you think of like root cellars and how important it was to save your cabbages and your carrots and anything else. I don't think potatoes were that commonly grown in colonial times, but our favorite things like carrots and cabbages had to carry them through the whole winter. And one thing we learned about that isn't grown very often now is skirrets, which I think it's the relative of parsnips, and they grow from a clump and come out as sort of little fingers, but kind of gnarly little roots that go down. But they're very nutritious and very tasty, and people commonly grew skirrets.
Were they a good keeper? Did they store well? Is that one of the other things? So they could store them through the winter. So it's like getting on April.
One of the nice things about them is you could store them in the ground and just harvest them when you needed them multiple times throughout the year.
Oh, wow.
They have hair roots, and then they have larger roots that form that you can cut out, replant the hair roots, and they grow again for a few harvests in the season. So they really tried to value plants that were perennial, that you could extend your seasons with, because if we wait for everything to grow in New England into May and June, you've got a lot of hungry months. So the things like skirrets or Jerusalem artichokes and ground nuts that were grown or foraged all hugely contributed to that ability to store foods. And that was a large part of it too. The skills you needed were to be a preservationist, to know how to put up all of these foods. And as you mentioned with root cellars, that's an important part of it. But how to pickle and preserve, how to make hotbeds and cold frames that extended the season, and how to be an organic gardener, remembering that the whole relationship we have with the land is reciprocal, and that as much compost and manure as you put into it is as much produce as you're going to yield. So they knew all of those things, but I also think there were realms of experience. So there were housewives and husbandmen, and the larger farm was more the sphere of the men at the time, and the household kitchen gardens and kitchen were the sphere of women and children. And while that can be problematic, it also created a greater respect, because they knew it took a whole family to make a household tick. So one labor wasn't valued over the other.
Mm-hmm. When we talk about these gardens and we say, the food alongside the herbs, it's something that is so sought after knowledge today of many gardeners, is this idea of pollinator gardens, or those companion plants, and planting things together because they grow better together. So is this what they were doing? They just knew how to do that, or that was just a beneficial way of planting?
I think the companion planting idea goes back to medieval times.
Yeah.
And but whether they called it that, I'm not sure. They would, but they kind of had this idea that certain things grew better, and then they had systems like planting by the different phases of the moon for different kind of crops. And I think it was just a way to kind of, in a way, impose a kind of order on what you did and proceed regularly through the planting year. You always did this in April, and you always did this in May, and you always did this in June, because it just
way to keep track.
Kind of a way to keep track.
On schedule. Yeah. Some of the earliest almanacs, the farmers' calendars, as you well know, they'll be like, you must weed now in May. Do not, don't waste time, haste on the weeding, because if you don't, you'll be sorry.
And boy, is that true.
And it's always these kind of scoldy things, like if you're not doing your potatoes now, you'll not have
doomed.
anything for the winter. And so, but
And rules like don't brew while beans are in blossom,
yes,
that kind of
these
thing.
rules. Yes.
Rules. There were certain rules that you had to kind of follow, and those little kind of maxims in the almanac, which people have always loved and people still repeat. I don't know if they kind of actually operate that way, but people love the idea that there's kind of a sense of order.
Yeah, there's a system.
And I think almanacs were always great at that because we all get caught up in our daily lives, but almanacs helped us organize our time as gardeners and farmers and remember all of those seasonal bits. So those adages were incredibly important, and a lot of them became part of our common speak. Don't plant until the shad bush is blooming, or the oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear. And a lot of that's indigenous knowledge. Other is colonial and immigrant knowledge that gets woven into those almanacs. But like you said, that idea of companion planting so overlapped with our ideas of pollinator gardens and all, because they weren't looking for monocultures like we do in modern agriculture. They really grew a lot of things alongside of one another that we wouldn't consider today. Through all my studies, I've never seen the term companion planting in historic sources until much later, but they'll say things like, this plant is a goodly companion unto this one, or this one is a mighty foe for this plant. And some of those things really, we all know about things like marigolds and tomatoes and stuff, but a lot of it is woven deeply into organic and sustainable practices like the Three Sisters agriculture. It meant that the beans were fixing nitrogen in the soil, which was fertilizer for the next year's crops. They'd climb up the corn stalks as poles instead of building structures. The squash and pumpkin vines would keep down the weeds and retain moisture. And all together, you got those three crops bringing in pollinators, 3 different harvest times, so you'll always have surviving plants. They had things like planting thyme and clove gilliflower under roses as a companion plant, because we know when you have something like that, it prevents the black backsplash that brings up the powdery mildew they're susceptible to. But they also thought it improved the perfume of roses to do so. So layers and layers are embedded like that in their history.
Now we just call it underplanting or something like that.
Something
but I like your
not that
explanation.
evocative.
Yeah, I like your explanation much better.
Yes, I think it's so interesting that it didn't, or like, would you say a goodly companion or a terrible foe? Yeah. There's so much interest in this area now. I feel like with modern gardeners that, we've come across many studies that universities and others are really doing to prove the efficacy, which is kind of funny because 300 years didn't prove it enough. But, this idea that really looking at what are the factors at play, which is really interesting. And we've had just such a demand for that information from people, which again is kind of this, it was such a standard art for the household, and now we're trying to relearn that.
And do you think it's partly that people are more aware of the decline in the number of pollinators and the decline in the bird populations, and realizing that we need everybody to be thriving?
Absolutely.
For all of us to be thriving.
I think the pollinators are the thing that people have really keyed in on, and they're adding a lot of more native plants, to their landscapes, both their, edible gardens, but also their ornamental gardens. I think we see a lot of demand for that, and, the bird population as well. We hear a lot from more large-scale farmers that due to, warming temperatures, the right insects or birds miss the blossoms because they are going earlier, so sometimes the timing is off, and that's really bringing attention to this idea that then we need to diversify and be able to bring in maybe other pollinators or figure that out. So I think it's because of not very great effects of some of this monoculture and not doing the work of making sure that there's natives in the landscape.
And I wonder if the climate is changing faster than the pollinators and even we are able to adapt to it. And we have to kind of figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there.
We were talking, Susan's story actually is called Eat Your Skirrets, I think and how skirrets, have fallen out of favor, but are there some, and maybe we could talk about why people don't grow them. Are there some other crops that have gone out of favor that were really standard crops, and then any that you'd say, like, we should bring those back?
Well, the reason I read that skirrets went out of kind of out of fashion or whatever is that they're kind of like skinny, like really skinny, long little parsnips and kind of raggedy. And you had to really hand clean them in order to get all the dirt off. And they were good keepers. They tasted good. They also have a kind of little woody core. And so when people started more kind of commercial level gardening, it was too much handwork really to clean them. And I'm sure people who really loved them just grew them in their own gardens, but they weren't widely grown anymore. Mm-hmm. And then potatoes came along more in the 19th century, I think.
Are there any crops, John, that you've bemoan the loss of?
I think market commoditization of things shifted this a lot too, because it's a smaller root crop and they dry more quickly. And so much of what we've done is, and especially in the modern day, create hybrids and now GMOs that can be harvested unripe, shipped thousands of miles and stored endlessly. And we wonder why they go from stone hard to mush the next day. But for so many of these historic crops, they were what you grew to supplement your daily diet and find ways like a skirret to harvest them. But, they weren't more labor intensive. They weren't more anything except not really fit for market production.
Did you grow them at Strawberry Bank?
I grew them at Strawberry Bank and at Plymouth Plantation. The first note of them coming to America, I believe, is John Winthrop's seed list in the Mass Bay colony. So we grew them at Plymouth Plantation and worked with all kinds of period recipes to cook them. Mm-hmm. And yeah, they're a wonderful introduction. But again, back to extending seasonality, I think that's an important part of it. So when I look at historic crops that offer forgotten flavors and that are worth reintroducing, I also think of native crops like ramps and fiddleheads that I grow in my own backyard now. So I've been able to rematriate them and get them established where they would have been growing throughout all of history. I've worked to reintroduce plants like the cranberry bean that we found in seed packets in the walls of a 17th century house. So, and long pie pumpkin, which is another one of this region's heirloom crops, the speckled trout lettuce and tennis ball lettuce and Boothby blonde cucumbers. They were all things that we find evidence for and remaining seeds that have been handed down to us through the generations. Because with heirloom seeds, that's part of the key, is you can save the seeds and not only have them be true to type, but adapt them to the soil and the climate and the region right in your backyard. So I love to find a way to reintroduce those plants and get all the chefs and the farmers growing them so that those crops of our region become the staples in our region again that you'll see at farmers market. Even things like cider apples that we'd stopped growing, finding, if you look around New Hampshire, all these great cider orchards that are growing varieties that haven't been seen in centuries since we cut the orchards down for Prohibition that had those wonderful apples. So things like that I love to see reintroduced and bring back some of those forgotten flavors.
What's the best way to eat a skirret?
To me, no fuss. You can look at upper class recipes that talk about peeling them. I would no more peel a skirret. I would wash them and throw them in any soup or stew that I'm making. Another was a takeoff of a parsnip fritter that I loved, which was, because it said use parsnips or skirrets. If you have leftovers that are soft, after you've cooked them, you cut up either parsnips or skirrets and basically put them into Johnny cakes and skillet fry them, a little butter or a little oil. It's one of the most delicious things, and I'd really probably not have a Thanksgiving dinner without that at the table.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's awesome. You could grate them and make hash browns.
Yeah, skirret browns.
So it wasn't all food, I just want to touch on that a little bit, that, another story that Susan did for us was about shrubbery that George Washington had at Mount Vernon. We have lots of records, and he was a fantastic gardener, but we think we called it something like George Washington was no schlub when it came to iconic shrubs. He had, viburnum and mock orange and rhododendrons and all that stuff. And so, okay, so if George Washington walks into a modern garden center, what surprises him the most?
I'm sure it's the hybridization and the incredible variety, for one thing.
What would he say, John?
I think he would be amazed that people are willing to buy pre-grown pots or Instapots of things like fully grown tomatoes. And, there's a quote from George Washington about the value and the craft of saving seeds and how important it is, and how a man is impoverished if he can't save his own seeds, but rich if he knows how to save the best seeds of his crop and grow them from year to year. And for all the things we used to care about with Yankee thrift, to me, this commercialism has gone so far in the wrong direction that he'd be a little bit amazed and kind of astounded that we weren't still saving our own seeds as commonly as he would have advocated for in his day.
One of the trends we identified in the next garden guide is that more people are growing from seed. It's really a growing trend among backyard growers. I think that they're starting to understand, well, first of all, there's the cost. People are, sharing seeds. One packet might have 60. If you put 60 zucchini plants in your backyard, you're going to be in trouble. So, the sharing of seeds, but also knowledge along the way, which is so fantastic. Again, this idea of what was old, what we did, what, people on the same land did just a few hundred years ago, we're rediscovering the beauty and the utility of that.
And sharing that skill set, that knowledge is so important, because we can read things that make it seem so difficult that you want to go out and buy. And, you can hear about floating tomato seeds until they're fermented. When my grandfather ate a good tomato that he liked, he'd say, "Oh, this is the best tomato." And he'd smear the seeds of that tomato that was just eaten on a brown paper bag and write plum tomato on it and put it up on top of his ice box till it was dried, and then fold it up and tie it up with the string he always saved and peel it off for the next spring's planting. And I think sometimes we make things so complicated and we don't teach the skills and pass them on to the next generation. And that was always a critical part of what almanacs taught and what household knowledge taught. It was just a commonly shared thing that we need to get back to sharing, because you're right, it is starting to happen again, and it's an important thing to see and help happen successfully.
We could encourage people to start with simple things like beans, which if say you grow scarlet runner beans, which I've done, and then I save from year to year some of the beans that are dry enough, put them in a little jar, and then plant them again the next spring. And I love that plant because you get the flowers and the beans.
Yeah, it's a beautiful plant.
Yeah. And it gives you deep roots, deep connections. And you can get so many kids that are watching TV thinking they only want to buy pre-made foods that are marketed. But really, when a kid grows something from seed, they see a whole different world in front of them. But also that value of growing in place is important. I watch people buying sets of spinach and lettuce and radish and coriander, which are just destined to bolt. When you plant something from seed, you can start a month earlier, get all of those same crops, and really have something that isn't just going to flower because it's in shock of transplant, but something that grew in place at the pace it really wanted to.
So we're talking about things that have changed and things that haven't changed, and I think so what are the things that have not changed at all? Or maybe things we're relearning. And then this idea of transplants and, starter plants is something. But what are things that have happened since 1776 that we couldn't live without, that have been great improvements? Are there any?
one of the things that was one of the best things that ever came along is the garden hose attached to a faucet, so you didn't have to lug buckets of water everywhere.
Right, when the rain didn't cooperate. That's a good one. A hose is good. Are there other things you think have been vast improvements, John?
Oh, sure. So many things. I would never want to live in the past. I just like to borrow the best practices from it. I do, I'm not a purist about anything. I love going in and buying a hanging fuchsia for my hummingbirds or, things like that. But I think overall, what hasn't changed is, knowing that soil quality is everything. So we compost and we turn waste into what makes a garden thrive. I think what hasn't changed is that we're really appreciate seasonality, eating truly sun-ripened fruit like that tomato or peach from your garden that's unparalleled with anything you could buy. Really getting those early crops and the late fall season crops and enjoying them with your family. But I do think overall what we can celebrate is how many plants immigrants brought to America that have added to that American palate. And, there is no pure native that you can grow and keep a nation fed. I mean, beans, corn, and squash didn't come from New England. They migrated across the country. So I don't want to be a purist about any of this. I think the exchange of seeds and plants has been a very important one, and it's built the American diversity that I think we all celebrate, knowing that our gardens provide us so much beauty and flavor that it is a key.
So the things that we were getting right way back then, the soil, thinking about weather impacts, the seasonality, starting things from seeds. So those are things to celebrate. What other traditions do you think connect us back to 1776 in the garden? Are there others?
I think part of it is people really love to get their hands in the dirt. And, people that live in the city and maybe just have a balcony or something still love growing things in pots, even though they have to schlep the dirt up in the elevator to the 20th floor or wherever they live. There's something that just connects you with the important things of nature, I think, to just grow anything.
Just doing it. Just getting your hands in the dirt.
Growing things is very satisfying. Yeah. So that's a human thing.
Yeah, growing our own food. Are there other traditions that you think, that connect us to that history that we're rediscovering or have stayed with us?
Sure. And I think the almanac is such an important way for people to connect up to those historic traditions. And some of them, it's like when we talk about religion and science, we think they can't overlap. Everything overlaps. And in history, there's an ancient connection that goes back to the most primitive people anywhere at any time in the world, which was the moon and the phases of the moon. And you mentioned that earlier, but the almanacs always pointed to planting by the phases of the moon. And the most common thread in all of that was connectivity to the world around you, the universe around you, that I think every gardener's always appreciated more than the norm. But the idea was you plant root crops at the dark of the moon so that they're growing in the dark of the soil. And then with the full moon, you'd be planting crops that grow above the ground. That was the most common way to look at it. And it didn't mean you had to go out by the light of the full moon to do this, but even harvesting, they'd recognize that the moon has a draw. It draws up tides. It draws up children in childbirth. All kinds of things are influenced. And it did with the soil and in harvesting medicinal herbs that would have greater strength than in our planting patterns. So I love things that connect us to our ancient minds as well as history. And that would be one of them for me.
Okay, so we're starting to wrap up. You've planted historic gardens and you plant historic things, but if you were going to start from scratch and plant, a 1776 garden, what are those one or two plants that you're gonna have in there for sure?
Well, I think we know that just there's all the useful, edible and medicinal plants, but there's also the beautiful things like roses, which almost every garden had at least something grown for its beauty and its fragrance.
And utility.
And
Some
utility.
plants did all three, right?
Right?
Yeah.
Right. Some of the cabbage roses and the gallicas and the ones they brought over with them as little slips, probably like as little bare root plants, were treasured.
Mm-hmm. What about for you, John? What goes in that garden?
Heirlooms and natives, because nobody's advocating for them. The people that want to sell things will advocate well for the rest, so I don't need to. But finding the heirlooms of my region, trying to reintroduce them, the plants that tell me stories, that make connections to my ancestors and the people that lived on my property before me. Maybe it's your grandmother's iris or your aunt's rose, or there are wonderful plants that I think have a huge history here. Finding those things like the apple of our region, maybe the granite beauty, and upsetting the apple cart a little bit, like I write in my book about planting these things that help us build better systems, putting back some of these missing plants, because the stories that resonate with us are an important part of why we garden. And when we look at a world that's changing all the time, we all talk about resiliency these days, but I think gardeners, what I love about working with gardeners is they're the most resilient lot. Every year you look at your garden, what worked, what didn't. You're exhausted by fall, you rest in the winter, and then starting in the spring, you go back and you think, all right, what am I going to do this year? How am I going to adapt and change it, just like we do moving through the world? And I think our backyards are influencing, as you mentioned earlier, our watersheds and our green corridors, and finding the hope in that, whether it's a milkweed seed that you planted that's blowing down river and rematriating milkweed, or your grandmother's iris. It's all a part of this story, the ongoing story.
And also, we can share those plants with other people, and that's kind of a way of just kind of emphasizing the continuity through the generations of gardening. Like I have my dad's rhubarb and bearded iris and plants like that, but they were probably my grandma's before him. And peonies live longer than any of us, and I just treasure them, and I love giving little chunks of them to people because it sort of, I don't know, spreads the goodwill.
Yeah, I love that too. I love getting plants from people as well, and the knowledge that comes with it always too is so helpful. Mm-hmm. I'm not, as you know, I'm more of a food gardener than an ornamental gardener.
You're an awesome gardener.
Working on it, but yeah, I love when someone gives me something and tells me how to do it too, because that's the way I really learn.
Yeah, and they remind us of that person forever in our garden.
So
and
true.
So stories live on in plants, and my garden is a curated collection of the people that came before me. And I love that sense of place, that sense of belonging that gardens give us, because all the stories stay alive right there with us.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting what we've been talking about, that things like weeding and sharing and planting good things around other things because they like to be together, that those are gardening like it's 1776, and gardening for our own consumption and gardening for our own wellness, I think, is really important. So we're already connected in those ways. But let me ask you if there's anything else that you'd like to touch on this subject before we wrap our podcast.
I just had this thought as you were speaking that in 1776, those gardeners maybe looked back and thought, boy, what 100 years ago or 200 years ago, we're still growing some of the same things our ancestors grew. So it is really kind of,
There's a thread, a through line, shall we say.
Continuity,
Yeah. Any parting thoughts, John?
Well, just as we look at our history, it's important to recognize that in the last 100 years, we've lost over 90% of the genetic diversity among the crops that fed the world. And by growing heirlooms and natives, we're reintroducing things like the granite beauty and the long pie pumpkin and the cranberry bean that came about before the chemical companies bought up seed companies to patent saleable seeds for gardening in the Midwest. We're rebuilding local agriculture. And I love thinking that the bigger the mainstream gets, the more room there is for an undercurrent. And that's happening in the farmers markets, the backyard gardens, everywhere. These systems are bringing back local and seasonal agriculture and horticulture. And I
Gardening
just
is
think
very local.
participating in that, it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's also, we did a story on landrace. So, just growing things locally and keeping those seeds year to year, because, a tomato could adapt to where you are over time, and things like that are really important knowledge that, again, that sharing, I think is it has a heritage. So that's a good thing that we're keeping alive.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Susan. And
Nice to meet you, John.
yes, good to have you both on.
Likewise. And I'm just going to add, since we're talking about the revolution, you'd mentioned something about which plant would stand out the most. And I wanted to say, I think bee balm, because it looks like a firework. It made Liberty Teas, and they helped us win the war with bomb instead of bombs. And I say go gardeners. That's my kind of evolution or revolution. So let's do it from the ground up and find some common ground for a nation that helps heal the situations we're in. And plant more bee balm for us, for hummingbirds, for pollinators. Garden history has a lot to teach. And I hope you'll all come out and join us. Look at the almanacs, visit Bedrock Gardens, find what you can to learn wherever you are about the history and how you can keep it alive. It's not just something in an old book.
Right, do a revolutionary act, plant some bee balm. I think that's just about right for what we're talking about.
Would be a good crusade.
Yes, the bee balm crusade. All right.
All right.
Well, thank you both very much.
Thanks for the great work you're doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Spank and crash comes the hoe, and down go the pretty posies. A farmer cannot stand to cull flowers or converse in technicals at this time. These gay blossoms are naught but worthless weeds to him, and he must away with the trash in order for the growth and safety of his crops. Let no weeds be neglected. I know very well that weeding our crops is not quite so pleasant as gathering them, but one poor Richard Almanac says, "He that neglects to weed will surely come to need." Come on then, let us try what a little industry and perseverance can effect. Pull up all the dock in your mowing. Let no thistles be found on your ground. Let heartsease and pigweed and burdock and chickweed be exterminated. And that you may be enabled to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, put your weeds into the hogsty for manure. Believe me, for I am not joking. That's from the May Farmer's Calendar in 1831. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Old Farmer's Almanac podcast, focused on gardening like it's 1776. We invite you to join us next month when we preview the contents of the all-new 2027 edition of the Old Farmer's Almanac with members of our editorial team, and we'll share a bit about how each annual edition is created and delve deeper into some of the stories featured in the new publication.